Our next speaker for today, we have Mr. Mark Peters, Lead Information Assurance from Technica Corporation. Dr. Mark Peters works for Novetta as technical lead on several DoD cyber programs in San Antonio. A DevOps junkie, much of his time is spent integrating teams and automating out of repetition. A cybersecurity expert, he had a full USAF career and now holds multiple industry certifications, including a CISSP. He authored Cashing In on Cyber Power, analyzing cyber attacks from an economic perspective. In his spare time, he reads, thinks, writes, and then usually speaks and holds a judo black belt. A DevOps Institute ambassador and US chapter chair, he enjoys working with individuals across the globe on unique solutions. His topic for today is integrating security.
Good day. Welcome to this speech on integrating security. I'm Dr. Mark Peters, and I'm here at DevOps India Summit 2021. I am excited to be here and excited to be talking about a topic that is such a great focus of what I do. It's such a great focus for all of us moving forward in the DevOps community. And that's the topic of integrating security. As we talk today, we hit the agenda, hit the introduction, right? Those are kind of the necessary points as we move forward in this discussion, get to know you. If I was there in person, I'd be walking around the auditorium, I'd be saying hi, I might be handing out candy. But I'm not, so we're stuck with this introduction on the recording. We'll be talking today about our cyber threat landscape, what our threat looks like, and why it's important to move security forward, how we assess that value stream to move into security, and then how we integrate some of those security practices into our overall DevOps team. Now, I got into security because I work as a DevOps Institute ambassador, but I also work in the US as a technical lead on a federal program for the United States Air Force, working on a variety of different cyber weapon systems and trying to integrate those features. And as you can guess, for those features, security is very important. And it's very important for me. But our challenge is always, how do we integrate security? Because we've got the development, we've got the operation, we hear DevSecOps, but we've got to make that next step. We've got to find a way to bring things together. So the first step is always, we have to be able to put the problem on the table, right? We have to be able to talk about why we need security and why it's important, why we need to integrate that. So a lot of the problem for a lot of our teams, we blend together, and especially as I know at the government, that our security teams are used to separation. They're used to being compliance. They're used to working on their own and being off in a different area. 20 years ago, as a guess, maybe it was sooner, maybe it was longer, those security teams, they did ops or they did dev or they did networking, and they were good at it. They were really good at it. And they got promoted and they got highlighted. And somebody said, you know what, you're so good at that, you should start working on compliance. You should start making sure that everybody does that thing correctly because you do it so well. And they moved off, and those skills they had that got them promoted initially atrophied in favor of different skills. So what we need to do now is bring those folks back onto the same team, bring that security back into the same integration overall. And we do that through talking about those integration parameters, making sure that we have the right standards in place for our security teams and that we establish those standards. Being able to talk about risk management between our teams. Sometimes when we talk about risk, we don't understand the same terms back and forth between our security team and our dev team, or any of our other teams, or even our user teams for that matter. Or of course, we can always talk about whether we just want to buy a solution, whether we want to pay somebody to come in and do security for us and still not worry about that factor. So of course, as we talk about DevOps and we talk about the integration of your security, we have to talk about the 3 ways because the 3 ways are essential to the process moving forward. Flow is just as important for security as it is for DevOps. We need to make sure that security in practice does not actually constrain our workflows, that we perform the infamous shift left, that we roll security in everywhere, and we make sure that that security is effective. Now, at this point, I have to stop and tell a story because I'll tell a lot of stories along the way. I find stories are one of the most effective ways to deliver this process, to move us ahead. I had a security team, or I had a DevOps team, and I was working with them to do security. And they came to me and they were excited. They said, we've got a way, we've got flow, we've got security shifted left. Everything is working awesome. I said, well, what did you do? And they said, well, we put the scanner every time we merge code, every time we make a commit, the scan runs. I said, great. So what kind of results are you getting? I said, results? I don't understand. I said, well, you set up the scan runs every time, it checks your merge, it produces a set of vulnerability results. They said, oh. They said, no, we set it to true. Every time the scan runs, it passes security. So sometimes, even when we're getting the flow, we need to work better to get the right feedback from that situation so that we can really bring security into the fold. Because, of course, the faster we get feedback and the better feedback we get, the better processes we can make along the way. And those processes lead us to divide more experiments that we can learn from. In this case, how do we actually turn those scans on and then measure maybe a diff result between a baseline of the product and the new merge to show whether or not risk is being introduced along the way? So we always talk about security, and we tell another story. I apologize for the little hiccup, but again, stories are essential to understanding the process of integration. One of the stories I like to tell is about the Blanc brothers. And we talk about the Blanc brothers because it's actually the first ever network hack along the way. And what happened was in France, between Paris and Bordeaux, in Tours in the middle, they were running futures markets where you could make an investment and you could bet on the futures of beef or cotton or other products that they were selling. And if you knew the futures market, you could make a lot of money in it. Well, the Blanc brothers in 1834, so almost 200 years ago, not quite, but figured out that they could bribe an individual and inject a signal into the semaphore. And the semaphore is a visual telegraph. So you see the handles in there, and the handles would show different flags as they needed to make it. And it would go from Paris to Tours to Bordeaux. And there was error correcting at Paris to make sure they got the right signal out. But there wasn't any from Tours to Bordeaux along that path. So it was going through these different towers that were stationed every couple miles, just far enough to see with a telescope and passing the signal. So the Blanc brothers didn't crack the code, but they got a signal injected to show if the signal went up or if it went down, or if the futures went up or if the futures went down, they could tell what it was, and they could get one of their compatriots to ride the horse faster than that signal could go and make an investment at the far end in Bordeaux based on the fact that they already knew which way the market was going. So similar to an SQL injection, right, or cross-site scripting, they get it across, they get it into the process, and they get it go. Well, why do we need to talk about that? Because part of our DevOps process and part of our integrating security process is knowing what the risk is. In this case, it's a risk of loss. It's a risk of monetary loss, but it's knowing that there's vulnerabilities in your system, even when the systems are this primitive, I guess, in the process. So you have to understand the system goals in order to understand security. Another great example from security we talk about, a much more recent one, is Wannacry and Marcus Hutchins. Marcus Hutchins started out as a black hat and became a white hat during Wannacry when he actually found the stop code. But as we all know, the Wannacry was a ransomware attack in May of 2017. It was a crypto worm that went out and it made those ransomware attempts and then demanded a Bitcoin payment. It actually had been propagated by Eternal Blue, which was one of the set of hacks that supposedly came out of the NSA database that used these vulnerabilities to move forward, exploiting that older Windows Microsoft OS, right? And again, older systems, not with patches, because the conversations with security weren't had. Security wasn't integrated because they had the operations and they were driving forward with that operations without the backstep and that why security was important. Wannacry actually affected over 200,000 computers across 150 countries. Marcus Hutchins, in this case, just one individual, found out a kill switch. Every time Wannacry went out, it was reaching out to a site on the internet. And if that site was not there, it would continue to encrypt the software. So when Mr. Hutchins found that site in the code as he was breaking it down, he actually went and registered that site and set it up as just a basic opportunity. So then when the code went out reached and it found that it was there, it turned itself off and didn't actually encrypt the system. Again, a command and control, but knowing about security, knowing about patches, making sure the patches are maintained, and knowing what maintains value. You can get around ransomware by having the right backups, the right recovery systems, and most of all, in this case, the right patches to make sure that you're in line with security. So why do you need security? Why do we consider security as an essential element of what we do, especially in the DevOps environment? Well, we have to deal with threat. And what we consider threat is any person or thing which might do damage or danger to our DevOps practices. Now, these usually are internal threats, right? Internally, we tend to talk more about risks. But what we see over on the right is we see some of these clouds, and these are from one of the great sources if you're looking for things on security. If you're looking to convince the rest of your team that they need to be more involved in security and they need to look in the practice, the Verizon data breach reports. It's the VDBIR, I think, data breach incident reports. And these come out on a yearly basis, and they build from all the previous years. So what we see is that a lot of organizations experiencing these breaches were large businesses, but most of them are still caused by external actors, over 70%. And we see a large portion from the organized criminal groups, these being those types of actors that, like we said in the ransomware, that are people that are organized that are trying to take your money. There are things we need to worry about. And using those type of sources can help you find the ones that are important to you, where those breaches are occurring, and kind of at what rate they're occurring, because that Verizon report does go over time. And now we mentioned as well that we talk about cyber, right? A common definition of cyber. I think being at a DevOps summit, we all kind of know what the definition of cyber was. This one I grabbed off the U.S. National Defense Authorization Act, which gave us that independent network of information technology infrastructure, kind of everything that talks together, everything that does some kind of computer process. So knowing that we need security, knowing that these data breaches are out there and these threats are out there, we have to be able to talk about risk. We talked on this a little bit. We touched on it a little bit in that first Blanc Brothers story. But you really need to have a good understanding of risk because your compliance team, those security guys in the back, they talk about risk all the time. Most of their work is done in risk. The business folks, sometimes they talk about risk, but when they talk about risk, they're including opportunities and they're kind of coming at it from different sections. They're kind of talking about a business risk. What's the risk of us losing money versus what's the risk of something being hacked? But we need to be able to have the conversation. Say, you know what? Ultimately, those risks boil down to the same thing. If you get hacked, chances are you could lose money. If we lose all our systems to ransomware and we have to replace them, that's a significant investment that we had not planned for along the way. So the basic equation for risk, as you integrate your security teams, is that threat equals risk times vulnerability. Now, sometimes they break that down a little bit further. And vulnerability might be an asset times availability. It talk about threat space and scope space. But whatever you do, when you sit down with your team, have some type of equation in mind. Have how you're computing your risk so that you can talk to dev, you can talk to ops, and you can all talk about the same risk. And you can know what that risk is. And knowing when you have risk, or knowing when you have threat, because it's an equation, we can move it around, right? We can say that risk equals threat over vulnerability or any of the other mathematical configurations. We know what our vulnerabilities are. Is it that we haven't patched our systems, that we don't have a good patch plan, that we don't have a way ahead to help us move and help us accelerate into that process? So I also have a background with the Air Force, as I mentioned. One of those ways that when we talk about threat as part of that equation, we talk about a potential threat. We talked about that DBIR and looking at potential threats. And how do you really calculate that? Well, you look at the probability, the intent, and the capability of that threat. Is it likely that that threat is going to attack me? Do they have the actual intent to attack me, or is it just a generic attack? In some of the Wannacry ransomware, they went after everyone who hadn't patched their Windows systems. So you see, they didn't intend to attack you personally, but they did intend to attack anyone who is not caught up. And they had the capability to do it, and the probability, if your system wasn't patched, was pretty near the top that you could get infected and that this would do some damage to your system. Now, you may ask yourself if you can't just buy insurance, because insurance is a hotly debated topic about security out there. And one of my favorite examples is an example called Mondelez versus Zurich American. They filed for $100 million worth of damages from NotPetya, which was another instance of ransomware that bricked out their systems. Mondelez makes some food products. They distribute some food products that are associated with Cadbury. Zurich American is the insurance company. Well, they had it. They filed it. The claim went out. They were going to get their $100 million worth of equipment back from the equipment that had been bricked due to the ransomware. And then the government of England came out and said, you know what? NotPetya was an act of the Russian government. And Zurich declared, hey, well, that means it's an act of war. if it's an active war, you're not covered under your insurance for an active war, so it doesn't apply. So that's about knowing who's coming after you again, knowing that you have the right insurance. Now, this case was filed in October 2018 in a court in the state of Illinois and was still in pre-trial the last time I checked, about a month and a half ago. So this one's probably going to take a while to run through the courts and figure out what actually has to happen. But it's about integrating security, right? They went out and they got the insurance to help mitigate that risk, to help transfer that risk to someone else. But because it was a state act that they didn't know who was actually acting against them or who might potentially act against them, they didn't have the right factors enabled. So when you start with security, we always start where we are. We start where we are before we change anything. Because if you don't understand the process and you just start making changes, those changes are going to cause problems. You have to find out what your process is. You have to be able to go to people and have what we call the trust algorithm. And this was from Larry Mascherone, one of the DevSecOps founders, or not founders, but fathers, right? One of the original guys coming out talking about these type of things. As that in any set of teams, we have this trust algorithm. The credibility, reliability, and empathy over the self-interest. Are those teams more interested in themselves and what they're pushing out than demonstrating credibility, reliability, or empathy to other teams? And sometimes this can be different for security folks. Speaking as one, sometimes that self-interest to compliance overrules everything else. Security, when you find out what it is through using these metrics and these sensing sessions and identifying these problems, needs to be able to come in and say, you know what, we're all in this together. If it's not secure, it's a business risk. But if it doesn't get delivered on time in a competitive market, it is just as much of a business risk. We need to have that shared vision and objectives that help us drive forward into the security process, that help us lean forward into those things that we need to change. One of the things I recommend is you can use these value streaming metrics to align your procedures. You can use these value streaming just like we do for the development, just like we do for operations. Blend security in. Figure out where you want security to fit in your backlog, where you want them to fit in integration and delivery, and make sure that you use them effectively to get to that point. So with your security teams, some of those problems and solutions, right? Because we're getting past the basic understanding. Now we're starting to talk about how do we actually bring those teams in. What are some of the things I need to take away? We need to understand the tools and make sure that the right tools are there. We need to be able to challenge the old models and test new tools. Find out ways that the security can be just as involved in the testing. And this is another good place to tell a story, right? Because again, stories make it up. We were moving a team from Jenkins, and they were using Jenkins for a while. They decided Jenkins wasn't quite right for the development strategy they wanted, and they wanted to move to GitLab. And they said, hey, we're planning on making a move to GitLab. We're going to do some checks. We're going to look around, and we think GitLab's going to be the one. I said, well, that's great. I know a couple of people from GitLab. Let me get on GitLab. Let me talk to some of the vendors. Let me see what I have. So I started talking with GitLab because we've been using Jenkins. And I started looking at it. And I said, wow, this is great. They have all these new security features. They have all these tools. We're going to have all these answers right in the palm of our hand, right for security, right? All these metrics are going to be right there. And this is going to be it for us. And I went back to our development teams. I said, hey, that's awesome. This GitLab, this is going to be great. Here's what I want. Here's what I want. Here's what I want. And the developer looked at me and they said, oh, we already bought it. I said, what? So we already purchased the basic license for the business because that's all we need. And they hadn't included the security features. It's that communication and that understanding of tools. When you buy a new tool as a developer, when you buy a new tool as an operator, make sure you get a seat for your security guys in the training. Make sure you bring them into the process so that we can understand. Remember, they want to understand. We talked about them being the guys that were there 20 years ago and that had that top-end experience and that it's just scaled back some, right? They've been working compliance for so long. It doesn't mean they don't want to be in the process. Maybe it means they haven't the opportunity. And that also means being able to work transparently. This is just as much a challenge for your security team as it is for other developers. You may be used to working transparently. You may have that Kanban board down. Your workflow may be slick as can be, and it goes through and it shows everything and everybody's got it. Security is not always used to working down. Remember, they've been working off to the sides. They're kind of behind. We've got to bring them into the same thing. We need to be able to show our security flows. When we showed our security flows with the team and we put our flow up there and we participated in those meetings, we really started things moving. And because we were participating in those meetings and having that transparent work back and forth with that communication, we were able to accelerate. When it came time to putting together a policy for a compliance statement, we didn't have to go back and have somebody create us stuff. We already knew where it was. We knew where it was in the documentation. We knew the instances, and we could clip the actual code and say, look, right here, that's where your two-factor authentication is. That's how we set it up, and that's how it works. And we can put that in the policy statement because we know where it exists. It's a good thing to communicate. But even in communication, we still have to know what we protect. We have to talk to those teams. We have to make sure that we're measuring the right items, making sure that we have the right metrics for security. One of those changes that we see in DevOps is that in security, in that compliance section, we often talk about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Can we make things secure? Can we make sure that they're the right things? And can we make sure that they're available when needed? Well, when we go to the DevOps mindset, we kind of take that opposite perspective, or not opposite, but a different, because we're more worried about delivery. So we talk about distributed, immutable, and ephemeral. Our systems need to be distributed to as many people as possible so that they can always reach them, to ensure that we have that availability. But it also defends us against attack. It's not just locking down a single system, but distributing it out and building it on that container base or the basis where we can change as needed. Because using those containers or using that new type of architecture that we're bringing our security folks in makes them immutable, right? Once we deploy that distributed system, it doesn't change. And if it does change, we kill it and go to the next one. And we kill it and go to the next one. And that makes it secure. And that's what the security guys like to hear, right? Nobody can change it. Nobody can hack it. Nobody can get into it. Because as soon as it changes from that baseline, we kill it. We just boot up the next one. So there's no lateral movement. There's no escalation because they can't get past that initial stage. And we make them ephemeral. Just like they don't change. I've said we've killed it and bring up the next one. That makes them ephemeral. They're not designed to last forever. They're only designed to last till they fall out of parameters. And once they fall out of parameters, we keep moving on to the next one. We keep moving on to that next process. And that process can involve more of our protection metrics, right? Using those set of parameters, we talk about what are the actual crown jewels for your business. When you sit down with the security team, or if you're a security professional, when you sit down with your ops team, what is the business value? What are those areas from the value stream that you need to protect? Because if they get damaged, they will deny you value. And they will deny your opportunity to operate effectively. Could it be proprietary technical code? Are there special practices you use that nobody can do as well as you? And can you only get them because they're protected? If everybody else knew what they are, could they duplicate them? I hope not. That's one of the reasons I'm giving this talk, right? It's to share practices and share how we do these things. Maybe you have some elite employees. Maybe there's some people who are so good at what they do that you have to have them, and you have to protect those individuals. So you can identify that exposure. You can identify that exposure through the tiered security risks. You can say, this is a bottom risk, this is a middle risk, this is a higher risk. You can have a golden path. This is the key path that produces value. Just like you do critical paths in old program management. Now, we don't like to talk about that. I did get a program management certification once upon a time and remain certified. But there's that golden path, right, that creates the most value, the easiest way to get from one side to the other. But sometimes we still have that, even in DevOps. And we have to talk about common metrics. The security folks probably have different metrics, different vulnerability standards, different risks that they consider. You need to bring them into the fold and show them what metrics you're using as a DevOps team. The more visible the dashboards, the more data that's available right there on hand, under their fingertips, the more comfortable the security team's going to feel with what you're doing because they know what's there. And even better, hopefully they'll be able to ask and suggest for metrics. I mentioned earlier, one of the best metrics you can get is that difference tool, right? A diff tool. If you're running the same scan at your operational side as you are on the development side, and it scans and it says you have this many vulnerabilities or you have this many risks, as you bring new developments in, it should be the same or less. You shouldn't get new vulnerabilities introduced. And when you do get new vulnerabilities introduced, if you get new vulnerabilities introduced, you can always talk about that risk on a one-for-one basis. You can talk about, hey, do we want to accept that? Maybe that risk is so far behind our firewalls and behind our system that nobody else is ever going to get to it. Maybe that new vulnerability for that new code only occurs on executive level computers and only for the home station, right? Their hardwire, hard-coded development network they have at the main office and not for the laptop they take out on trips all the time. And that's just as important because that ties back to value. But those tie to the overall dashboards and the awareness and the observability of what's going on in your systems and what's going on in your networks. In some of those discussions, you're going to encounter this cultural difference. DevOps is about culture, right? Culture, automation, lean, metrics, and sharing are CALM's acronym as we move forward. So when we were first integrating that security team, we brought them all the way, we showed them the metrics, we still have to remember that their basis is from a waterfall system. They used to prefer a very vertical, very rigid system that requires a step-by-step approach to security so they don't miss anything. Because if they miss something and there's a security breach, the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, gets fired, and the CEO goes on to another banner year. So the CISO is very worried about it. But they have to learn to adapt, and they will adapt by being part of those teams. They will adapt by being part of that effective process if you bring them in and show them the value, if you communicate about the value as you move forward. And you can do that communication. You can encourage. We talked about the initial value stream. We talked about the DIE and the CIA by asking some questions about security, because these questions don't normally get asked by development or by operations, but these are good security questions, right? These are good things to talk about when you talk to your security professionals, when they come to your team meetings. What are my vulnerabilities? How do I fix it? Do you have a way to fix the vulnerabilities? A lot of vulnerabilities in the security system, a lot of what we call the CVE, that common vulnerability exposure, actually come with links to patches. A lot of the automated systems that we talked about you being able to buy have an automated patch with it. And it says, hey, I found a vulnerability. Would you like to patch it? Maybe you need to have the talk about patching it. Maybe you need to talk about whether patching that code actually affects your delivery at the end of the process. Why should I care? Why do I care about that vulnerability? I scan this every time and it gives me the same 400, 500 vulnerabilities, and they're just silly. We don't use that. We don't cooperate with that. It doesn't work. We had a system on the defense side, and one of the requirements was that they had to use a certain encryption standard. And they were required to use the encryption standard, and everybody who had a federal system was required to use the encryption standard. This was a NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology. I think we were under 853. And my guys came to me and they said, hey, we can't use the standard. I said, well, why can't you use the encryption standard? Everybody uses the encryption standard. I said, well, we're doing threat hunting. It's a pen test system. It's designed to let things come into it and see what happens. And if we encrypt it, it can't attack our files. So that makes sense, right? But you have to have that discussion. So we didn't encrypt it, and it's left because it's a pen test system. The back level from that is unencrypted, but the actual front end of the system that had to talk to do the pen testing and do the sandboxing of the malware is not, because it couldn't be. So, and then of course, how do we record it? How do we automate it? How do we bring it into those good DevOps processes so we can get the process all move forward? If you look at just a continuous security, you see security is everywhere. Every step of your processes, and this is a great example from Engineering DevOps by Mark Hornbeek, the book. I highly recommend it for everyone. He has a lot of good stuff in there, but this shows all the different tools at every level of your DevOps pipeline. You need to think about lean and value stream thinking to minimize your security waste, but you also need to think there's a bunch of different places along that system that you can inject security, because every area has those unique tools, and every area probably has a unique tool for you. Continuous security addresses your ability to do continual delivery because it's secure every time you move forward. You can do even continuous compliance. Here's an example from Azure, the Azure Security Center. You can see how it's looking for those functions, and you see right there, it tells you where it is. It tells you what the function is matched against. You can see that there's an Azure failure in the middle. There's a PCI DSS. There's a SOC failure. There's an ISO 27001. They have tools out there that will find these things for you, that will help you find these items, and that you can run them in your pipeline. And I bet your security guy probably knows where some of those vulnerability tools are. And if not, you should be working them to make them go out there and talk to those vendors and find out what security tools you can get to integrate security into your overall team and help make the entire process run faster. Because at the end of the day, for DevOps, it's all about practices and outcomes. We have test-driven development, and there's no reason those tests can't be security tests, that we can't do security-driven tests for either a positive outcome or a negative outcome, right? How much do we benefit if we say our system is this much secure? Or how much do we lose if we suffer from a data breach? Maybe what you need as part of that flow is security acceptance criteria. And that's what I was talking about, those scans and the shifting left. Is your system secure? Have you accepted it? When you accept it, when your product owner accepts it, do they consider it to be secure? Are we putting the risk or that bonus on them to move forward? How do we improve that collaboration? How do we get security down onto actual teams? Well, we've talked about shifting left, and shifting left moves them into the team earlier, which gets us our feedback earlier and shortens those loops and decreases the on-call task and improves the data science, right? When security starts telling you what they need to look for and how they need to look for it and what those functions are. Maybe there's some areas of feedback that you don't have yet in the system. Maybe you haven't integrated those scans or simply set them for true, and you need to run a test to see if you can. You need to run a test on the diff tool to do your continuous learning to get to your experimentation and be able to drive your way forward. Because ultimately, you want that continuous learning to show that you have a verification of that continuous compliance, that security is always there, and it becomes such an integral part of your way forward that you don't think about it as any different, that it's just security, and it's just the way forward through your value mapping. That creates that shared vision and objectives, talking together, working together, and aligning the process, being able to look at your product flow and see how long it takes you to get from step to step and where security is. And if security is delaying you, you need to find ways to reduce that. And I offer the best way to reduce it is get security into those teams. I don't think in most cases they're intentionally delaying you. They just have a different set of processes. And understanding each other's processes helps drive you forward. Because ultimately, it's about integrating security into your DevOps. We talk about DevSecOps. DevSecOps is nice, but it's really about DevOps, right? All the way through. DevOps should be secure. And the security professional should be part of that security process. There should be a balance between the work you spend and the value you get from your DevSecOps. You may have shortfalls in your system right now, and those shortfalls are going to drive action. If they're not all there, something is going to have to be done. But new action is going to create a further imbalance in the system. And that lack of balance will then require new action. So there's a constant measurement. There's a constant flow back and forth between these three areas as we attempt to measure them, as we attempt to balance everything. We need to start by having those simple metrics, those simple security aspects as your team that you can talk about. And those start with those 4 basic DevOps metrics, the base rates to be able to start where you are, to find that balance in how you integrate security. Because after all, balance is the journey, not the end. We're not going to stay balanced. We're going to keep moving and keep moving forward as we accelerate value. Thank you for your time. I've enjoyed being here today as part of the DevOps India Summit 2021. I'm Dr. Mark Peters. You can reach me at @tinycyber on Twitter or the LinkedIn profile below. Thank you very much.